The hound found her where no living soul should have been able to survive, half buried in snow at the edge of the ravine, the wind carving her shallow grave, grain by grain while the mountains watched in silence. Boone Callahan would have passed the place without a glance if Red hadn't frozen mid-stride, hackles raised, nose pressed to the ground as if it had caught the scent of death itself. Boone tugged the reins, irritated at first, because daylight was bleeding fast and winter in these parts did not forgive delays. But when Red let out a low, broken whine, Boone felt something twist deep in his chest. Red was no fool dog. He had tracked wolves, men, and wounded elk for years, and he did not cry like that for nothing. Boone dismounted, boots crunching through the crusted snow, and followed the hound down the slope until he saw the shape that did not belong to the land. A woman lay there, wrapped in a torn wool cloak stiff with ice, her dark hair plastered to her face, lips blue, chest barely moving. For one long moment, Boone simply stared. Because women did not end up here by accident, not this far from the settlements, not alone. He knelt, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, and nearly missed the pulse because it was so faint it felt like a whisper against his skin. She was alive, barely. Boone swore under his breath, shrugging off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders while Red licked her frozen hand as if trying to breathe warmth back into her bones. Boone had hauled wounded men out of worse places, but this felt different. This wasn't a hunter who took a bad step or a trapper caught in a storm. This was a woman who had been abandoned to die. He lifted her, surprised at how light she was, all sharp bones and fragile weight, and carried her up the ravine with the kind of care he usually reserved for a loaded rifle. The wind howled behind him like it was angry he'd stolen prey from it, but Boone didn't stop until he had her strapped to his saddle and Red trotting close, guarding her like she was already his own. By the time Boone reached his cabin, the sky had gone iron gray and snow was starting to fall again, thick and relentless. He carried her inside, laid her by the hearth and worked fast, hands steady from years of necessity rather than kindness. He cut away wet cloth, rubbed her limbs until his arms burned, fed her warm broth a spoon at a time when her lips finally parted. Hours passed before she stirred, and when she did, her eyes flew open in panic, dark and wild, like a deer caught in a trap. She tried to scramble back, weak fingers clawing at the floor, and Boone held up his hands, voice low, calm, the way you spoke to frightened animals and broken people. He told her she was safe, that she was inside, that the storm couldn't reach her now. She stared at him as if trying to decide whether to believe a man she had never seen before in her life. Finally, exhaustion won, and her head slumped back, breath evening out though her body still trembled. Boone watched her for a long time, studying the lines of her face, the faint scar near her temple, the way her hands curled like she was still holding on to something even in sleep. He noticed things then that unsettled him. The quality of her clothing, though ruined, was finer than what most women wore out here. Her boots were city-made, not trail-worn, and on her finger, beneath grime and frostbite, was a thin gold ring she hadn't bothered to remove. Boone frowned, unease creeping in. He had ordered a mail-order bride himself 3 months ago. More out of practicality than romance, a simple arrangement meant to bring order to a lonely life carved from wilderness. The letter from the agency said she would arrive by wagon before winter closed the pass. She never came. Boone had assumed she changed her mind. Women did that. He didn't blame them. He blamed the land. He hadn't thought about it much since, burying the disappointment under work and silence. But now, as the fire crackled and Red lay at the woman's feet like a sentry, Boone felt the faint echo of that old decision stir in his mind. He pushed it away. Plenty of women traveled west. Plenty of stories ended badly. There was no sense inventing connections where none existed. When the woman woke again, it was morning. Pale light spilled through the window, and the storm had softened the world into a white hush. She blinked, confused. Then her eyes found Boone where he sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Fear flickered again, but this time it didn't take over. She swallowed, voice raw when she spoke. She asked where she was. Boone told her the truth. His cabin, miles from anywhere worth naming. She tried to sit up and winced, clutching her side. Boone crossed the room in 2 strides and helped her back down, telling her she'd nearly frozen to death and needed rest whether she liked it or not. She studied him closely then, as if measuring the weight of his words against his rough hands and steady gaze. Finally she nodded, a small weary motion. She told him her name was Eleanor. Just Eleanor. No last name offered. Boone didn't press. He poured her more broth, and when she asked how he found her, he nodded toward Red, who thumped his tail once like he understood the praise. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide, turning her face away. Boone pretended not to notice. People held on to dignity any way they could out here. Over the next days, Eleanor grew stronger. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was careful. Her words chosen like stepping stones across deep water. Boone learned she had been traveling west by wagon, that something went wrong, that she'd been left behind when illness slowed her down. She didn't say who left her. She didn't say why no one came back. Boone didn't ask the questions his gut screamed at him to ask. He knew what desperation did to people. He had seen men abandon brothers for less than a chance at survival. Still, things didn't add up. Eleanor could read and write with ease. Her accent was educated. Her manners refined even when exhaustion stripped her down to her core. She was not the kind of woman meant to disappear into the snow unnoticed. At night, Boone lay awake, listening to the wind and wondering who she really was and what kind of life had broken her, enough to leave her where death could claim her. Red stayed glued to her side, as if he knew something Boone didn't. One evening, while Eleanor slept, Boone opened the small leather satchel he'd found with her belongings. He hadn't meant to pry, but survival had taught him that secrets could kill. Inside were a few coins, a pressed flower gone brittle with age, and a folded letter stamped with the seal of the very agency Boone had written 2 months ago. His chest tightened as he unfolded it. Reading words meant for a woman promised a new life with a man she had never met. Boone's name was not on the page, but the destination was. His land, his cabin, his future. Boone sat there for a long time, the fire burning low, realization settling over him like the snow outside. The woman sleeping under his roof was not just some lost traveler. She was a mail-order bride. And if fate had twisted the trail just a little differently, she might have been his. Boone looked toward the bed, where Eleanor breathed softly, unaware that the truth was circling closer. He didn't know yet who she truly was beyond that letter, or why she had been left to die before reaching her destination. But one thing was clear. Saving her had already changed his life. And when the full truth came out, it would test everything he believed about mercy, fate, and the kind of man he wanted to be. If you want to know what happens when Boone finally confronts her and what secret Eleanor is carrying that could destroy them both, make sure you stay with this story, because Chapter 2 will reveal the truth no one saw coming. And if you enjoy powerful frontier tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next chapter is where survival turns into destiny. Boone did not sleep after reading the letter, and by dawn the truth had settled into his bones like old pain, dull but impossible to ignore, because every time Eleanor shifted in her sleep or Red lifted his head to check on her, Boone felt the weight of what he now knew pressing down harder. The letter was simple, almost hopeful in its tone, promising safety, honesty, and a future built on mutual need rather than love. And Boone had written his own words with that same careful restraint months earlier, believing that companionship was something you could arrange like supplies before winter. Yet now the idea felt almost cruel. When Eleanor finally woke, Boone watched her face for signs of recognition, for guilt or fear or something that would tell him she knew how close she had come to his life even before the storm. But she met his gaze calmly, asking if she could help with breakfast, as if nothing in the world had shifted. Boone said little, letting the hours stretch while he worked outside chopping wood and checking traps, trying to convince himself that the letter meant nothing, that coincidence still existed in a land ruled by chance. But the longer the silence lasted, the more he understood that silence itself had become a kind of lie. It was Eleanor who broke it first. Near evening, as the sky burned orange behind the pines, she asked him why he looked at her like he was searching for something he had lost. Boone froze, axe hanging heavy in his hands, and realized there was no path forward that did not pass through the truth. He told her about the letter, about the agency, about the woman who was supposed to come before winter, sealed the mountain passes, and he watched her face drain of color as each word landed. Eleanor's hands trembled, and she sat down hard on the bench, eyes fixed on the floor like it might open up and swallow her whole. She whispered then that her full name was Eleanor Whitcomb, that she had answered an advertisement because her family was ruined, because her father's debts had turned friends into enemies. Because marrying a stranger in the West seemed kinder than staying where. Whispers followed her like shadows. Boone listened, heart pounding. As she admitted she had been promised to another man. Not Boone, someone wealthier. Someone whose land bordered Boone's to the south. A man known for his temper and his hunger for control. She said she had learned the truth too late. Overhearing talk at a way station. Realizing she had traded one cage for another. Panic had driven her to run. Illness slowed her. And when the wagon master decided she was dead weight, they left her with a blanket and a lie whispered to the others that she had chosen to stay behind. Boone felt rage rise like a storm, hot and blinding, because he knew the kind of men who bought women like livestock, and he knew the law would not save her. Eleanor lifted her eyes then, and in them was not fear but resolve, telling him she did not expect protection or charity, only time to recover before she moved on, because she refused to be claimed by a future that terrified her more than death. Boone laughed once, sharp and humorless, because fate had a cruel sense of timing, and he told her that moving on was not so simple, that the man expecting her would eventually come looking, and when he did, the truth would spill whether they wanted it to or not. Days passed in uneasy calm, each one thick with things unsaid, until hoofbeats cut through the quiet one morning, and Boone knew before he even saw the rider that the reckoning had arrived. The man introduced himself as Cyrus Hale, his smile too smooth, his eyes cold when they landed on Eleanor standing rigid in the doorway. He spoke of contracts and expectations, of property and promises, and when Eleanor stepped forward and said she would not go with him, Cyrus laughed like it was a child's tantrum. Boone stepped between them then, rifle resting easy in his hands, and told Cyrus the woman had nearly died because of abandonment, and that no agreement justified that kind of cruelty. Cyrus's smile vanished, replaced by something dangerous, and he reminded Boone that the law favored men with papers and witnesses. Boone replied that the land favored men who knew how to survive on it. The standoff stretched, Red growling low at Boone's side, until Cyrus realized there would be no easy victory here. He left with threats instead of promises, swearing this was not over. When the dust settled, Eleanor's strength seemed to drain all at once, and she sagged against Boone, tears finally spilling free. Boone held her then, not as a savior or a hunter or a man bound by letters and contracts, but as someone who understood that survival sometimes meant choosing who you stood with when the world closed in. He told her she could stay not because of obligation, not because of fate's cruel joke, but because he wanted her there, because loneliness carved into him just as deeply as fear had carved into her. Eleanor looked up at him, hope and terror warring in her eyes, and nodded. Winter closed the past soon after, sealing them together in a fragile peace neither fully trusted yet, but as snow piled against the cabin walls and the fire burned steady, something stronger than fear began to take root. The Hound had found her dying, yes, but what followed was not just rescue, it was choice, and choice carried a power that no contract ever could. If you want to see how Boone and Eleanor faced the consequences of defying fate and whether love born from survival can endure the world that hunts it, make sure you subscribe to the channel now, because stories like this are just beginning, and the next one may be even more unforgettable.